What happens when someone who has spent their entire career fighting discrimination finds themselves face to face with the very prejudice they've worked to eliminate? When privilege meets the architect of its own accountability. This is the remarkable, true story of how one moment of casual racism on a routine flight triggered a response that would ground aircraft nationwide and expose the hidden systems of bias that have plagued the aviation industry for decades. Imagine boarding a flight, settling into the first-class seat you've rightfully purchased, only to have a stranger tell you that you don't belong there. For most people, this would be a moment of humiliation and powerlessness. But what if that stranger had just unknowingly confronted the very person who had designed the systems meant to prevent such discrimination? What if their victim possessed the power to not just seek justice, but to transform an entire industry? This is the extraordinary story of Ariel DuPont, a visionary CEO whose quiet dignity in the face of racism would become a catalyst for unprecedented change in aviation. It's a story that begins with a simple flight from New York to San Francisco, where the casual entitlement of one passenger would collide with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent her career ensuring that such moments of discrimination would never go unchallenged. In an era where airline discrimination cases have made headlines with settlements reaching into the millions, where black passengers have been removed from flights over fabricated complaints, and where the aviation industry has been forced to confront its own systemic biases, this story represents something more than individual justice. It represents the power of preparation, the strength of silent leadership, and the reality that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single person refusing to accept the unacceptable. This is more than a story about stolen seats and grounded flights. It's about the courage to stand firm when others try to make you smaller, and the wisdom to use your power not for revenge, but for revolution. Ariel DuPont's journey to becoming one of the most influential CEOs in aviation began long before she ever set foot in a corporate boardroom. Born in Detroit to a family of educators, she learned early that excellence wasn't just expected, it was essential for survival in a world that often questioned her right to exist in certain spaces. Her father, a high school mathematics teacher, and her mother, a college professor specializing in organizational psychology, instilled in her a unique combination of analytical thinking and deep understanding of human behavior that would prove invaluable in her future career. Growing up in the 1990s, Ariel witnessed the slow integration of corporate America, watching as barriers gradually fell, but prejudices persisted in more subtle forms. She excelled academically, earning scholarships to Princeton University, where she studied systems engineering with a focus on organizational behavior. It was during her college years that she first encountered the aviation industry, not as a passenger, but as a researcher studying the psychological impacts of travel discrimination on minority communities. Her early career took her through consulting firms where she specialized in identifying and dismantling systemic biases within large organizations. By age 28, she had become one of the youngest partners at McKinsey & Company, where she led groundbreaking research on unconscious bias in service industries. Her work caught the attention of Ascend Air, a mid-sized airline struggling with recurring discrimination incidents and declining customer satisfaction among minority travelers. When Ascend Air approached her to lead their diversity and inclusion initiatives, Ariel saw an opportunity to create something unprecedented. Rather than simply implementing training programs or policy changes, she envisioned a comprehensive transformation that would weave equity into every aspect of the airline's operations. Her innovative approach caught the attention of the board, and within 3 years, she had been promoted to CEO, becoming one of the few black women to lead a major airline. The aviation industry that Ariel entered was one with a complex and troubling history of discrimination. From the early days of commercial flight, when black passengers were routinely denied service or relegated to inferior accommodations, to the more recent incidents of passengers being removed from flights based on pretextual complaints, the industry had struggled to shake its legacy of exclusion. Studies had shown that black passengers were disproportionately likely to experience random additional screening, be questioned about their seat assignments, or face suspicion about their right to be in premium cabins. Recent years had brought a series of high-profile incidents that highlighted the persistence of these problems. American Airlines had faced multiple lawsuits, including a case where 3 black men were removed from a flight over false complaints about body odor, resulting in a significant settlement. Delta Airlines had been sued by passengers who alleged discriminatory treatment in first-class cabins. United Airlines had dealt with incidents involving Asian American passengers being mistaken for each other and removed from flights. These cases had cost airlines millions in settlements and had begun to attract federal attention to systemic discrimination in aviation that under Ariel's leadership. Ascend Air had become a model for inclusive practices in the industry. She had implemented advanced training programs for staff, developed protocols for handling discrimination complaints, and created systems for tracking and addressing bias incidents. Her innovations had been studied by other airlines and had earned her recognition as one of the most influential leaders in corporate America, with profiles in Forbes and Bloomberg highlighting her transformative approach to leadership. The company's success under her direction had been remarkable. Customer satisfaction scores had reached industry-leading levels. Employee retention had improved dramatically, and the airline had become the preferred choice for many minority travelers who had previously avoided air travel due to past negative experiences. Ariel's approach of silent power, leading through actions rather than words, creating change through systems rather than rhetoric, had proven incredibly effective. But despite all her success, despite the systems she had built and the progress she had made, Ariel knew that the work was far from over. She understood that discrimination persisted not just in overt acts of hostility, but in the countless small moments where people made assumptions about who belonged where, who deserved respect, and who had the right to occupy spaces of privilege. It was this combination of personal experience and professional expertise that would prove crucial on that fateful morning when her quiet authority would be tested at 35,000 feet. The morning of March 15th began like countless others for Ariel DuPont. She had arrived at JFK International Airport at 6:30 a.m. for her 8:45 flight to San Francisco, where she was scheduled to deliver the keynote address at the National Aviation Equity Summit. The irony of the day's events would not be lost on her later. She was traveling to speak about combating discrimination in aviation, carrying with her years of research and a presentation that would outline new industry standards for inclusive practices. Ariel moved through the airport with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that contained her presentation materials, she embodied the kind of professional presence that should have commanded respect in any setting. Yet she was acutely aware of the subtle looks, the double takes, the way some people seemed to question her presence in the first-class lounge dot as she boarded Ascend Air Flight 728. She nodded politely to the flight crew, several of whom she recognized from her regular travels on the route. The flight attendant, Naomi Wynn, had been with the company for 8 years and had witnessed firsthand the cultural transformation that had occurred under Ariel's leadership. Naomi offered a warm smile and directed her to seat 3C. Though she already knew exactly where she was going, the first-class cabin was nearly empty, with only a handful of passengers scattered throughout the section. Ariel settled into her window seat, placing her portfolio in the seat pocket and pulling out her tablet to review her presentation one final time. She had spent months preparing for this speech, knowing that the aviation industry was at a crossroads, facing increasing scrutiny over discrimination practices and pressure from federal regulators to implement meaningful reforms. As she worked quietly, she noticed a man in his early 50s settling into seat 3A across the aisle. Calder carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to deference, his platinum frequent flyer credentials clearly visible on his laptop bag. His expensive suit and confident demeanor marked him as a seasoned business traveler, the type who had likely spent decades accumulating the kind of airline status that came with privileges and expectations. For the first 20 minutes of the flight, there was no interaction between them. Ariel continued her work while Calder busied himself with his tablet, occasionally glancing around the cabin with the restless energy of someone unaccustomed to being confined. It was only after the plane reached cruising altitude that the situation began to unfold. The trigger came when Calder stood to retrieve something from his overhead bin and noticed Ariel's notebook open on her tray table. From his angle, he could see what appeared to be organizational charts and policy documents, though he couldn't make out the specific details. His curiosity piqued. He began to study her more closely, taking in her professional attire and the quiet authority with which she carried herself. "Excuse me," he said, leaning slightly across the aisle. "Are you with one of the consulting firms? I noticed you're reviewing what looks like airline policy documents." Ariel looked up from her work, her expression neutral but alert. "I'm preparing for a presentation," she replied simply, offering no additional details. Calder's smile was friendly, but carried an undertone of assumption. "Ah, a presentation. What kind of consulting do you do?" "I'm always interested in meeting fellow travelers who work in the industry." "I work in aviation," Ariel responded, her tone remaining professional, but providing no opening for further intrusion. This seemed to satisfy Calder's curiosity for the moment, and he returned to his seat. But as the flight continued, his attention kept drifting back to her, and his behavior began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. He began to claim more space, spreading his coat across the empty middle seat 3B and placing his shoes in the aisle in a way that encroached on the common area. The real confrontation began when Calder stood again and looked directly at Ariel's seat. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a casual authority that he clearly expected to be respected, "I really do need to stretch out for this flight. I have a medical condition that requires me to lie flat occasionally. Would you mind?" "Terribly if I used your seat. I'm sure there are other available seats in the cabin." Ariel looked up from her tablet, her expression calm but unmistakably firm. "This is seat 3C, she said, showing her boarding pass. "My assigned seat. I believe you're in 3A. Calder's expression shifted slightly, his smile becoming more forced. "Well, yes, technically that's true. But I'm a platinum member, and I've been flying this route for 15 years. I usually have the entire row to myself. The airline typically accommodates my medical needs." "I understand," Ariel replied, her voice remaining steady. "But I have a confirmed assignment for this seat, and I intend to remain here." The conversation drew the attention of other passengers, who began to watch the interaction with growing discomfort. Calder's voice rose slightly, though he maintained a veneer of reasonableness. "Look, I'm not trying to be difficult here, but this is about more than just seat assignments. Some of us have earned certain privileges through our loyalty to this airline. I'm sure you can understand that." The implication was clear, though carefully coded. Calder was asserting a hierarchy based on his perceived status, his assumption being that Ariel, as a black woman, couldn't possibly have earned the same level of consideration. His language about earning privileges and loyalty carried undertones that anyone familiar with discrimination would recognize. Ariel's response was measured but resolute. "I understand loyalty and privilege," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to give Calder pause. I also understand that seat assignments are contractual obligations, not suggestions based on assumptions about who belongs where. The tension in the cabin was now palpable. Other passengers had stopped their conversations to observe the confrontation, and flight attendant Naomi Wynn was making her way down the aisle, having noticed the disturbance. Calder's frustration was becoming more apparent, his veneer of politeness beginning to crack. "This is ridiculous," he said, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "I've been flying first class since before you were probably even allowed to." He caught himself, but the implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The silence that followed was deafening. Every passenger in the cabin had heard the barely contained racist remark, and the collective intake of breath was audible. Calder realized he had crossed a line, but rather than apologizing, he doubled down on his sense of entitlement. "All I'm asking for is basic courtesy," he continued, his voice now carrying an edge of desperation. "Some recognition of the fact that long-time customers deserve consideration. This is about respect and understanding your place in the hierarchy of service." Ariel remained seated, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. She had encountered this type of confrontation before, both personally and professionally. She understood that this was about more than a seat assignment. It was about power, privilege, and the assumptions that people make about who belongs were based on nothing more than appearance and prejudice. "Mr. Ree," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to command attention from everyone in the cabin, "I believe you're confused about how airline seating works. Perhaps the flight attendant can clarify the situation for you." It was at this moment that Naomi Wynn reached their row, her expression professional, but clearly concerned about the escalating situation. She had witnessed enough discrimination, incidents during her career to recognize the dynamics at play, and she was prepared to intervene according to the protocols that had been established under Ariel's leadership. What none of them realized was that they were about to witness the activation of the most sophisticated anti-discrimination response system in aviation history, a VA system that would transform this single incident into a catalyst for industry-wide change. The immediate aftermath of Calder's barely contained racist outburst created a moment of crystalline clarity for everyone in the first-class cabin. Ariel remained seated, her composure unshaken, but those who knew her well might have noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, the way her fingers moved almost imperceptibly across her phone screen, the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated her mind was working through complex calculations. What passengers couldn't see was that Ariel's phone was connected to Ascend Air's proprietary incident response system, a sophisticated network she had designed and implemented over her years as CEO. With a few discreet touches, she had activated what the company internally called Protocol 7, a comprehensive response mechanism designed to address discrimination incidents in real time while gathering evidence and protecting victims. Flight attendant Naomi Wynn approached the situation with the professional training that had been revolutionized under Ariel's leadership. Rather than attempting to smooth over the conflict or asking Ariel to move to appease the disruptive passenger, she addressed Calder directly. "Sir, I need to verify the seat assignments. May I see your boarding pass?" Calder's frustration was evident as he handed over his boarding pass, his voice carrying the tone of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. "This is seat 3A, but I specifically requested the ability to use the entire row. I have medical documentation that supports my need for additional space." Naomi examined the boarding pass and checked her tablet. "Mr. Ree, I show that you have a confirmed assignment for seat 3A. There's no record of any special accommodation request or medical documentation on file. The passenger in 3C has a confirmed assignment for that seat." The exchange that followed revealed the depth of Calder's assumptions and the systematic nature of the discrimination that Ariel had spent her career fighting. rather than accepting. The clear explanation, Calder began to question Ariel's right to be in first class at all. "How do I know this isn't some kind of upgrade situation?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Maybe she's supposed to be in coach and got bumped up. These things happen all the time. Long-time customers like myself should have priority in these situations." The implication was clear and deeply offensive. Calder was suggesting that Ariel, as a black woman, couldn't possibly be a legitimate first-class passenger and must have somehow received an undeserved upgrade. His language about long time, customers, and priority was code for the belief that certain types of people belonged in premium cabins, while others did not. Ariel's response was measured but firm. "Mr. Ree, I purchased my ticket 3 weeks ago. I have a confirmed reservation for seat 3C. I travel this route frequently, and I have never required special accommodations or exceptions to standard policies." The tension in the cabin was now affecting other passengers, who were beginning to express their discomfort with the situation. A woman in seat 2 turned around and spoke directly to Calder. "Sir, this is completely inappropriate. The young lady has shown you her boarding pass. She has every right to be in her assigned seat." This intervention from another passenger seemed to further inflame Calder's sense of injustice. "This isn't about seat assignments," he said, his voice now carrying clear anger. "This is about respect and understanding how things work in the real world. Some of us have earned our place here through years of loyalty and substantial investment in this airline." It was at this moment that Ariel made the decision that would change everything. Rather than continuing to defend her right to occupy a seat she had legally purchased, she stood up and spoke with the quiet authority that had made her one of the most respected leaders in corporate America. "Mr. Ree," she said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about how things work in the real world. You seem to be operating under the assumption that your comfort and preferences take precedence over other passengers. Contractual rights. You've suggested that I don't belong in first class, questioned my right to my assigned seat, and implied that your loyalty to this airline grants you special privileges over other paying customers." The cabin fell silent as other passengers absorbed the implications of what they were witnessing. Calder's face reddened as he realized that his behavior was being publicly called out, but rather than backing down, he doubled down on his position. "I'm not trying to be discriminatory," he said, his voice defensive. "I'm just trying to be practical. This is about customer service and understanding that some passengers have different needs and different levels of investment in the airline." Ariel's response was swift and precise. "Mr. Ree, customer service means treating all passengers with equal respect and dignity. It means honoring the contractual obligations that come with ticket purchases. It does not mean creating hierarchies based on assumptions about who belongs where or who deserves what level of consideration." The confrontation was creating a ripple effect throughout the cabin. Other passengers were now actively supporting Ariel, with several people taking out their phones to record the incident. The flight crew was gathering near the front of the cabin, clearly preparing to escalate the situation if necessary. What passengers didn't realize was that Ariel's phone had been discreetly recording the entire conversation while simultaneously transmitting real-time updates to Ascend Air's corporate headquarters. The Protocol 7 system was designed to ensure that discrimination incidents were documented, analyzed, and addressed with swift and decisive action. As the confrontation continued, Calder's true beliefs became increasingly apparent. His language about loyalty and investment was revealed to be code for racial and economic prejudice. His assumption that Ariel didn't belong in first class was based entirely on her race and gender, not on any legitimate concerns about seat assignments or customer service. The breaking point came when Calder, frustrated by his inability to get Ariel to move and embarrassed by the lack of support from other passengers, made a statement that would seal his fate. This is exactly what's wrong with society today. People think they can just take whatever they want without earning it. Some of us have worked hard to get where we are, and we deserve to be treated accordingly. The racist undertones of this statement were unmistakable to everyone in the cabin. Ariel, who had earned her position through decades of excellence and innovation, was being told that she hadn't earned her place in first class. The implication that she had somehow taken something that didn't belong to her was a textbook example of the kind of discrimination that had plagued the aviation industry for decades. It was at this moment that Ariel revealed the full extent of her power and the systems she had built to combat exactly this kind of discrimination. The transformation that followed Ariel's decision to fully engage with the situation was swift and decisive. What had begun as a simple seat dispute was about to become a demonstration of how modern corporate leadership could respond to discrimination with precision, authority, and unprecedented consequences. Ariel stood up slowly, her movement commanding the attention of everyone in the first-class cabin. Rather than raising her voice or matching Calder's aggression, she spoke with the quiet authority that had made her one of the most respected leaders in corporate America. "Mr. Rhee," she began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin, "I believe there's something you should know about the airline you're flying today." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "My name is Ariel DuPont. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Ascend Air." The silence that followed was absolute. The revelation hit the cabin like a physical force, transforming the dynamic of the entire situation in an instant. Calder's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then dawning horror as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "You single quotes re ... he stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating completely. "I am the CEO of this airline," Ariel repeated, her voice steady and clear. "The same airline whose policies you've been questioning, whose customer service standards you've been challenging, and whose commitment to equal treatment you've been dismissing." The other passengers in the cabin began to murmur among themselves, the implications of what they were witnessing beginning to sink in. A young woman in seat 2C pulled out her phone and began recording, recognizing that she was witnessing a moment that would likely become significant beyond the confines of the aircraft. Calder's response was a mixture of panic and disbelief. "That's impossible," he said, his voice weak. "You can't be the CEO. I would have recognized you. I've been flying this airline for 15 years. Ariel's response was measured but devastating. "Mr. Rhee, your assumption that you would have recognized me reveals exactly the kind of bias that my company has been working to eliminate. You assumed that a black woman couldn't be the CEO of a major airline. You assumed that I didn't belong in first class. You assumed that your loyalty and status entitled you to special treatment at the expense of other passengers." As the reality of the situation sank in, Calder began to backpedal desperately. "I didn't mean anything by it. I was just trying to be practical. I had no idea who you were. If I had known..." "If you had known what, Mr. Rhee?" Ariel interrupted. "If you had known that I was the CEO, you would have treated me differently. But you felt perfectly comfortable treating who you thought was just another passenger with disrespect and discrimination." The flight attendant, Naomi Wynn, approached with a tablet in hand. "Ma'am," she said, addressing Ariel with the professional respect that had always characterized their interactions, "I've documented the entire incident per Protocol 7. The recording has been transmitted to headquarters, and we've received confirmation that the incident response team is standing by." Ariel nodded, then turned her attention back to Calder, who was now visibly shaking. "Mr. Rhee, what you've experienced today is the result of systems I've spent years developing to ensure that discrimination on my airline is swiftly identified and addressed. Your behavior has been recorded, documented, and transmitted to our corporate headquarters. It has also been witnessed by a cabin full of passengers who can testify to the discriminatory nature of your actions. The impact of her words was immediate and profound. Calder seemed to shrink in his seat, the full weight of his situation becoming clear. He had not only embarrassed himself in front of a cabin full of strangers, but he had also revealed his prejudices to the very person who had the power to ensure there would be consequences for his behavior. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ariel's response was swift and decisive. "Now, Mr. Ree, you face the consequences of your actions. Ascend Air has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Your behavior today violated not only our customer conduct policies, but also federal regulations regarding harassment and discrimination in commercial aviation." She paused, allowing the gravity of the situation to fully sink in. "Upon landing, you will be met by airport security and Ascend Air Management. You will be permanently banned from flying on this airline, and a full report of this incident will be filed with the appropriate federal authorities. Additionally, the recording of your behavior will be shared with other airlines as part of our industry-wide effort to combat discrimination." The cabin erupted in applause as other passengers showed their support for Ariel's decisive action. The woman who had spoken up earlier stood and began clapping, and soon the entire first-class cabin was applauding the CEO's handling of the situation. Calder sat in stunned silence, the full implications of his behavior finally becoming clear. He had not only lost his dignity and his flying privileges, but he had also become an example of the kind of discrimination that the aviation industry was working to eliminate. As the applause died down, Ariel returned to her seat and calmly resumed her work on her presentation. The incident had provided her with a real-world example of how discrimination manifested in aviation, and she was already incorporating the lessons learned into her upcoming speech at the National Aviation Equity Summit. The flight continued in relative quiet, with passengers occasionally glancing at both Ariel and Calder, processing what they had witnessed. The incident had transformed from a simple seat dispute into a powerful demonstration of leadership, accountability, and the consequences of discriminatory behavior in the modern aviation industry. The landing in San Francisco marked the beginning of a series of events that would reverberate throughout the aviation industry and beyond. As Flight 728 taxied to the gate, Ariel could see through her window that airport security personnel and Ascend Air Management were already waiting on the tarmac, ready to escort Calder Ree for what would be a lengthy debriefing session. The immediate consequences for Calder were swift and severe. As promised, he was permanently banned from flying Ascend Air, with the incident report shared across industry databases that would make it difficult for him to book flights on other major carriers. The federal authorities opened an investigation into his behavior, and the widespread media coverage of the incident sparked by passenger recordings that quickly went viral destroyed his reputation in the business community. But the real impact of the incident extended far beyond the punishment of one individual. Ariel's handling of the situation became a case study in corporate leadership and crisis management, demonstrating how companies could respond to discrimination with both compassion for victims and decisive action against perpetrators. 48 hours of the incident, Ascend Air launched the Seat 3A initiative, a comprehensive program named after the seat where the discrimination had originated. The initiative included mandatory bias training for all employees, enhanced protocols for handling discrimination incidents, and a new passenger Bill of Rights that explicitly protected travelers from harassment based on race, gender, or other protected characteristics. The program's centerpiece was a revolutionary rapid response system that Ariel had developed, allowing flight crews to immediately document and address discrimination incidents while they were occurring. The system included real-time recording capabilities, automatic notification of corporate headquarters, and pre-established protocols for removing disruptive passengers who engaged in discriminatory behavior. The aviation industry took notice. Within months of the Seat 3 initiative's launch, competitors began implementing similar programs, driven by both regulatory pressure and consumer demand for more equitable treatment. The Federal Aviation Administration cited Ascend Air's program as a model for industry-wide adoption, and several other airlines hired consultants to help them develop comparable systems. Ariel's keynote address at the National Aviation Equity Summit, delivered just hours after the incident, became one of the most widely viewed presentations in the conference's history. She used the fresh example of what had occurred on her flight to illustrate the persistent challenges facing the industry, while also demonstrating how those challenges could be addressed through systematic, evidence-based approaches. What happened? On Flight 728 this morning was not an isolated incident, she told the audience. It was a manifestation of systemic biases that have plagued our industry for decades. But it was also a demonstration of how we can respond to these challenges with clarity, conviction, and concrete action. The long-term impact of the incident extended beyond the aviation industry. Business schools began using the case study to teach crisis management and ethical leadership. The incident became part of diversity and inclusion training programs across multiple industries, illustrating how discrimination manifested in everyday situations and how leaders could respond effectively. For Ariel personally, the incident reinforced her commitment to using her platform to combat discrimination wherever she encountered it. She established the DuPont Foundation for Aviation Equity, which provided scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in aviation, and funded research into bias reduction in transportation industries. The foundation's work had measurable impacts. Over the following years, the percentage of minority pilots, flight attendants, and aviation executives increased significantly. The industry's customer satisfaction scores among minority travelers improved dramatically, and the number of discrimination complaints filed with federal regulators decreased substantially. Perhaps most importantly, the incident changed the conversation about discrimination in aviation. Rather than being seen as isolated incidents involving difficult passengers, discriminatory behavior began to be understood as a systemic problem requiring systematic solutions. The industry's response to the Seat 3A initiative demonstrated that corporate leadership could make a real difference in combating prejudice and creating more equitable environments. The transformation was reflected in customer loyalty numbers. Ascend Air's market share among minority travelers increased by 40% in the 2 years following the incident, as passengers chose to fly with an airline that had demonstrated its commitment to treating all customers with dignity and respect. The incident also had broader cultural implications. The viral videos of Ariel's calm but firm response to discrimination inspired countless individuals facing similar situations in their own lives. The hashtag Seat3A became a symbol of dignified resistance to prejudice, used by people sharing their own stories of discrimination and the ways they had chosen to respond. 5 years after the incident, Ariel reflected on its impact during an interview with Harvard Business Review. What happened that day wasn't just about one passenger's bad behavior, she said. It was about creating a moment of clarity that allowed us to demonstrate what accountability looks like in the modern business world. It showed that discrimination doesn't have to be tolerated, and that leaders have both the power and the responsibility to create change. The story of Ariel DuPont and Flight 728 offers profound lessons about the nature of discrimination, the power of leadership, and the possibility of transformation in even the most entrenched systems. It demonstrates that racism persists not just in overt acts of hostility, but in the countless assumptions people make about who belongs where, who deserves respect, and who has the right to occupy spaces of privilege. But perhaps more importantly, it shows that discrimination can be effectively challenged when individuals possess both the tools and the courage to demand accountability. Ariel's response to Calder's behavior was not just about defending her own dignity, was about creating a precedent that would protect countless future passengers from similar treatment. The incident reveals the extraordinary power that can be unleashed when preparation meets opportunity. Ariel's years of work developing anti-discrimination systems, her deep understanding of bias psychology, and her position of authority all converged in a single moment to create unprecedented change. Her story reminds us that the most effective responses to injustice often come not from anger or confrontation, but from strategic thinking and systematic action. The transformation that followed this incident from individual accountability to industry-wide reform demonstrates that change is possible even in systems that seem resistant to progress. The aviation industry's embrace of the SEEP3 initiative and similar programs shows that businesses can be motivated to act when discrimination is exposed and accountability is demanded. For viewers, this story serves as both inspiration and call to action. It reminds us that we all have power, even when we appear powerless to those who would discriminate against us. It shows that the skills we develop in our professional lives can be applied to combat injustice in our communities. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the most profound changes often begin with a single person refusing to accept the unacceptable. The next time you witness discrimination, remember Ariel DuPont. Remember that quiet dignity can be more powerful than loud protest, that systematic action can be more effective than emotional reaction, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not through confrontation, but through the patient work of building systems that make justice inevitable. In the end, Calder learned the hardest lesson of all, that in the modern world, the person you choose to discriminate against might just be the person with a power to ensure that such discrimination never happens again.